morning, everyone. It's so great to see this crowd of people here. I'm assuming it has something to do with what's going on, and also all of you really wanting to hear Jeff Halper. Before I introduce him, I just want to say a couple of words. First of all, thank you to the Kairos Mission Group of Oakhurst Baptist Church for hosting this and supporting this kind of event. And just tell you the other three groups that are also co-sponsoring this event. And one is the Tikkun Olam Committee, or the Social Justice Committee of Beit Covering Synagogue, who are trying to keep open dialogues and talk about Israel and Palestine more within our community. And then Jewish Voice for Peace Atlanta. It's a national organization, but we do have a chapter in Atlanta for anybody that's interested in getting involved, and I can talk to you more about that afterward. And there's some JCC folks here. And Interfaith Peace Builders, which is an organization that takes delegations of North Americans to meet with nonviolent human rights Israeli and Palestinian activists like Jeff. And we meet with him almost every time that we go to get an analysis of what's happening. And the last group, of course, is Joining Hands for Justice in Israel and Palestine. And there are plenty of folks here who are also part of that group. So I would encourage you, if you're not a part of any of these groups and have interest in what's going on, is to connect to people. So I'd like to give a very short introduction to Jeff. I've known him for about 20 years. He's been doing amazing work and founded the organization Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. His work is very powerful because part of what he does is, in the multiple destructions of Palestinian homes, that he's able to resist and stand with Israelis, Palestinians, and internationals to rebuild those homes, even though Israel might continue to destroy them. So he'll be able to give an analysis of what's going on, tell some of his stories, and of course answer all your questions. So I'm also going to send around a notepad for any of you that are not on the email list that get updates about events happening in Atlanta on Israel and Palestine. Please put your name on it. If you know you're on my email list, you don't need to put your name, but you could if you just want to say, hi, I was here. Okay? All right. Okay, so I could stall and say, how is everybody on this hot day? All right, so Jeff will be with us in just a minute.
Sorry about that. We had to just plan B. Thank you for having me here at the church. Thanks for the introduction. Huh?
There's a dimmer.
So, yeah, as Elise said, I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, which is an Israeli peace and human rights organization that's dedicated to ending the occupation completely and totally, and to achieving a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. You know, we're in the midst of another war today on Gaza. And it could very well be that Israel, unless it's happening, and I haven't heard in the last few hours, that Israel could actually invade Gaza with ground troops. It's been hitting Gaza with about 11 strikes an hour. And Gaza, you know, is an area the size probably not the size of metropolitan Atlanta, I think. With 1.5 million people. It's one of the most densely populated parts of the world. It has 3 times the density of Bangladesh. And locked into a little, it's 35 miles long, and in some places a mile wide, a mile and a half, sometimes 4 miles wide. It really is a little strip of land. And on that land, 1.5 million people live. And this is the 3rd all-out attack on this little tiny enclave of Gaza in the last 5 years. And we're talking about an army, the Israeli Army and Air Force, that's really the equivalent, even superior to European armies. I mean, Israel is the 4th largest nuclear power in the world. Israel exports more arms than Britain and China. Sort of tied with France in terms of arms exports. It uses highly sophisticated weaponry, partly of its own, partly American weaponry. I mean, Gaza is being attacked by F-16s that are, of course, American warplanes. And so in a way, the whole, not only the occupation, but I would say the conflict is seen as an American-Israeli conflict, occupation, form of oppression, and not simply Israeli. I think it's clear that Israel couldn't maintain it for a month without the political and military and financial support it gets from the United States. And in fact, that's what enables Israel to do what it wants to do. Because as outrageous as its actions are, as long as it has bipartisan support in Congress, it doesn't care. Nobody can touch it. And you see it today. I mean, the Obama administration today issued an announcement saying that Israel has every right for self-defense. So that, Israel feels, I think, free to do this because of American support. So one question is, why should we care so much about this conflict, even though it's going on today, but the wider implications. And what I would argue is that this conflict is not simply a localized conflict between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. If it was that, it would be less of an interest to everyone. There's thousands of conflicts. And in certain ways, in terms of the scale of violence, the number of deaths, there's worse conflicts. The Congo, for example. But the Arab-Israeli conflict is disruptive of the entire international system. I mean, it's the source. It isn't the cause of all the conflicts, obviously, in the Middle East, but it certainly is a prime cause of the alienation between the Muslim world and the United States and the West. We're talking about the Holy Land, but it's not only the Holy Land for Jews and Christians, but also for Muslims, where Israel has a declared policy of Judaizing the Holy Land, which also affects Christians. In 1977, there were about 15% of the Palestinian population in what became the occupied territories was Christian. And the Christians were the backbone of the Palestinian middle class. Today, less than 1.4% of the Palestinians in the West Bank, including Bethlehem and East Jerusalem and Gaza, are Christians. So that it's not only a negation of the Muslim concept of the Holy Land, the Judaization of the Holy Land, making the Holy Land a Jewish place exclusively, but it affects Christians. And of course, it also, is a kind of, it's almost the last gasp of an outright neo-colonialism. So the Palestinians have become kind of an emblematic people for people all over the world who are oppressed, and for whom human rights and international law are sort of the only ways they can get a little bit of a grasp of some hope, of some equality in the world, a better world. A lot rides on the Israel-Palestine conflict, because in a sense it's this emblematic conflict. It's happening in the light of day, on the southern border of Europe, with Europeans and Americans oppressing third world peoples of color in the Holy Land, in absolute violation of international law, of human rights, and of dozens of UN resolutions. So that on the one hand, this is a real challenge. We don't live in Hollywood, despite what Ronald Reagan thought. And the good guys don't always win. I mean, there is a chance that the occupation will prevail. And in fact, an entire people, and we're seeing it today, could be imprisoned and completely, as we see today, vulnerable to any kind of violence, suppressed forever, in the Holy Land, in the light of day, and with the support of the United States. And that sends a chilling message, I would think, to all the oppressed, and not just the oppressed people, to all of us as well, because we're in line, that you have actions, that international law and human rights are really just, you just give lip service to it. And I would say, speaking in a church, that in a sense it's a challenge to all religious values. Because there's a dovetailing of human rights with the religious language that we use in our churches and synagogues and mosques. In other words, the religions are based on the idea that humans are created in the image of God. That's the religious imagery. And we have values of love and compassion and justice and custodianship and so on. Well, human rights is based on the same values. Human rights is based on the concept of the dignity of human beings. And human rights says, the concept says that there's a floor below which a human life is no longer human. And what's been wonderful, actually, over the last 60 or 70 years, is that through the UN system, the international community has been nailing down the planks of that floor. What does that floor really mean? And it means in terms of housing, education, equal rights, civil rights, children's rights, women's rights, environmental rights, issues of racism. In other words, there are dozens of international laws that are wonderful. And not only that, but they give that value added, or they give teeth to the religious values. So where the religious values are important in terms of articulating things in terms of love and justice, for example, human rights gives you instruments for pursuing that. That you have an international court of justice, you have international criminal courts, you have tribunals that can be convened to enforce human rights conventions and international laws. These are things that are at our disposal as the people. And governments fear them. And governments try not only not to use them, but to prevent us from using them. So that if, in fact, the occupation wins, and an entire people in the Holy Land is permanently warehoused and imprisoned, it really sets us all back to square one. I mean, it makes both our religious values and our commitment to human rights and equality hollow. I mean, it just becomes nice things to say. And in that sense, I think it's very much like the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And it was the same idea, that you couldn't have a country in our international family that was based on overt racism, like South Africa. It sullied the whole system. And I think that this has that same kind of a power of saying, if Israel in fact prevails here with the help of the United States, that again, we're facing a very bleak future. So that there's a lot riding on this conflict. And I don't think Americans are also very aware of how much their uncritical support of Israel, their government support of Israel, it isolates them in the world. So when you have, for example, repeated United Nations votes where it's everybody in the world against the United States, Israel, and Micronesia. You know, well, that should set up some warning lights. And it's not only in Israel-Palestine. It has to do with human rights issues, has to do with landmine issues, it has to do with arms control. And you're beginning to have this anti-human rights bloc of Israel and the United States and one or two Pacific atolls that they can find against the rest of the world. So I think the United States is paying a tremendous price for this, from the point of view of not only whatever leadership it could give in the world, including its own values, but in the sense that I think it's getting more and more isolated, and it could be that the rest of the world will simply bypass the United States. So that this is an American conflict, and that's why it should be a concern to Americans. So what I'd like to do is take a few minutes and kind of give you some background about the conflict, assuming that we know more. I mean, the people here are probably people that know. You probably know quite a bit, but I'll just put it into a certain context. Then what I'd like to do is walk you through a house demolition. I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Israel has demolished 30,000 Palestinian homes in the occupied territory since 1967. And I want to sort of do that in order to show you how the occupation works and the human cost of occupation, so that we can then go and at the end begin to understand where we are in the conflict, where it could go, and then we'll have time for discussion. Okay? So it's easy. We can begin with the solution, in a sense. This is what's called the two-state solution. It's the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict that's been accepted almost unanimously by the international community since 1967. And it's a simple idea that basically there's one country. That one country is called the land of Israel for Jews. It's called Palestine for Palestinians. It's called the land of Israel, or the promised land, or the holy land for religious people. But the point is that it's one country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And all the internal divisions that change every few years are artificial and temporary and don't mean anything. And so the concept of the two-state solution was simply that there's two peoples living in this one country. Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. Now, whether there should have been two peoples, going back to the whole history in some ways, isn't relevant right now. The relevant point is there are two peoples living in this country. How can they live together? And the two-state solution basically said two states for two peoples, which makes sense, at least on paper. Of course, if you look at the map, you see it wasn't really a fair and just solution. Because in this one country, today, half the population is Palestinian. And there's about 5 million refugees living around, and then living in a larger Palestinian diaspora, who claim the right of return. So even if some of those refugees come back, if only a few refugees come back, there will be a Palestinian majority in this country. And yet, you know, we often hear about Ehud Barak's generous offer. That's thrown up all the time. That's an urban myth. There never was any such thing. But, you know, he made a generous offer, and Arafat refused, and Arafat walked away at Camp David and started an intifada. That's the story. You never hear about Arafat's generous offer, which might have been too generous, in fact. And that is, Arafat said in 1988, the Palestinians, the PLO, accepted the two-state solution. In other words, this is 26, 27 years ago that the PLO formally and publicly accepted the two-state solution. So Arafat basically said, even though we're half the population of this country, even though we will be the majority in this country, even though this country has been for centuries our homeland, even though before 1948, 93% of the land of this country was owned by Palestinians, we will give up political claim to 78% of the country. I mean, that's unprecedented. Did you ever hear of a colonized people that say we give up claim to 78% of our country? I mean, would the Americans give up claim to Texas and California? Texas, maybe. Texas, I think that. Okay, not California, though. In other words, and to say that even though we will be the majority in our country, we will make peace with you, with our oppressors. We will make peace with you for less than a quarter of the land. All of the occupied territories, we have to remember. If Israel got out of every inch of the West Bank of the Jordan River, East Jerusalem, including the Old City, and Gaza, it adds up to 22% of historic Palestine. So that's all the Palestinians are claiming. And this was 25, 26 years ago. We could have been a quarter of a century into peace. Especially if Israel claims always that it wants peace and security, you could have had that 25 years ago and 78% of the country. That sounds like a pretty generous offer to me. And how would that have impacted on Syria and Egypt and Lebanon and Iraq? I'm not saying this conflict is the cause of all of that instability, but certainly making peace here would have removed a huge source of militarism and divisiveness and alienation, and would have allowed the peoples of the Middle East to get on with developing their part of the world. Instead, it became, and it still is, a source of divisiveness and of oppression, really. So that the Americans, the Europeans, the whole international community accepted the two-state solution in 1967, 47 years ago. The Palestinians accepted it 25, 26 years ago. In 2002, the entire Arab League unanimously accepted the two-state solution. And not only that, but they said, if you give up the occupied territories, we will integrate you into the region. There was talk of Israel joining the Arab League. So that across the board there was agreement. I'll even go further. All the polls have shown over the years that the majority of Israeli Jews accept the two-state solution. They're not sure what it means exactly, because they don't know the map very well. But 85% of Israeli Jews supported the Oslo peace process at one point. So that you've got that across the board. There's only one holdout, and that is successive Israeli governments. Labor and Likud. We can't blame Begin and Sharon and Netanyahu for all of this. In fact, the Labor Party worked harder to establish and make permanent the occupation than the Likud did. But successive Israeli governments have said no. And they haven't only said no, but they have laid over the occupied territories what I call a matrix of control. The idea is it's not enough simply to have a negotiating position of saying this whole country is ours. There is no West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. There is no East Jerusalem. It's all simply Jerusalem that's been annexed to Israel. But we have to create facts on the ground that completely prejudice any negotiations. In other words, we'll go into negotiations as Israelis, but only if the outcomes are predetermined. You see? And so in a sense, the facts on the ground do that. I would submit that there is no more, the two-state solution was based on the idea that there was a detachable, coherent territory here and Gaza, and then there'd be some connection that could be a Palestinian state. Small state, but it would be a state with a border with Arab countries, with a port, with an airport, with a coherent territory, with important tourist sites. I don't know, a country that has Jerusalem and Bethlehem in it, has a certain economic viability, and so on. So what Israel did was to fragment the entire West Bank to a point where there is no more territory, place where a Palestinian state can emerge. And without going into details, what Israel did basically was, first of all, carve up the West Bank into what we call areas A and B. These are the brown blotches on this map. The darker brown are Area A, which is under Palestinian Authority control, supposedly. I mean, just this week, Israel invaded Ramallah and Bethlehem. So this is all simply on paper. And then Area B is also kind of under Israeli security control, but Palestinian civil control. A and B are about 70 little islands on 38% of the occupied territories. And then, of course, Gaza, that's really a cage. So that we can say that after all these years of negotiations that began in 1991 in Madrid, before Oslo, all the Palestinians have eked out of Israel is 38% of 22% of their country. And that truncated into all these little islands, into which 95% of the Palestinians have been confined, pushed and confined. In other words, Area C, the 62% of the West Bank, that's all the gray areas and the pink areas and the blue. All these blue dots are settlements. There's about 200 Israeli settlements. More than 500,000 Israelis living in the occupied territories. And Area C then surrounds all these little Palestinian islands. And the Palestinian population of Area C has been forcibly removed and shoved into areas A and B. For example, in 1967, there used to be 250,000 Palestinians living in the Jordan Valley. Today, there's less than 50,000. And 30,000 of them live in Jericho. You see, so they've all either been driven out of the country, like the middle classes. This is where the Christians went. The Christians left the country because they simply couldn't make a living, they couldn't. Middle-class people have the wherewithal to leave, and the farmers and the other people were pushed into areas A and B. So Israel claims today that there already is a two-state solution. There already is. 95% of the Palestinians live under a Palestinian government in areas A and B. So if you don't know the map, most people don't know, and it sounds great. 95% of the Palestinians have Abu Mazen as their president. There is a two-state solution. So what are they fighting about? You see, without really knowing the fact that they're shoved into these little islands that are unviable, that have no resources. 100% of the water in the West Bank is controlled by Israel in Area C. And of course they can't move. There's no freedom of movement. There's 600 checkpoints. And so on. So that fragmentation has happened. The settlements have been built. These pink areas are what are called settlement blocks. And this is something else that Americans don't know. In 2004, President Bush wrote a letter to Sharon, Prime Minister, saying that these settlement blocks, roughly, there wasn't a clear map, but these are the settlement blocks, belong to Israel. They are Israel. And they're not to be negotiated. They didn't call them settlement blocks. In the Bush letter, they were called existing major Israeli population centers, by which they didn't mean Tel Aviv. So that these were already recognized by the Bush administration as Israel. And that was a letter that was reaffirmed almost unanimously by both houses of Congress. And it was reaffirmed a few months ago by Obama in a speech before AIPAC. So when Kerry goes to negotiate the two-state solution, he's not negotiating a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. East Jerusalem's already been annexed to Israel, and Israel has announced, and it was accepted, that it's non-negotiable. We're not negotiating Jerusalem. And the settlement blocks have already been accepted as a part of Israel. So what Kerry was really negotiating was how much of the 70% of the West Bank that falls outside of the settlement blocks, what Israel calls cantons, how much of that is going to be Palestinian and how much does Israel retain? That further fragments the West Bank and links the settlements into Israel proper. You see, so there is no more, I would argue, there is no more West Bank. Israel has created one state. Today, there is one state in this country. There's one government, there's one army, there's one electrical system, there's one highway system, there's one water system, there's one currency. It's all shekels. It's all controlled by Israel, with a certain little collaborationist regime that I believe is on its way out. And if Israel eliminated the two-state solution, then we have to say, well, what's next? And Israel's going to have to begin to accept the idea, I think, of a one-state solution. We could talk about that. Now, in all of this, then, part of the confinement of the Palestinians was house demolitions. And all kinds of policies around it that drove them out of Area C into Areas A and B, or out of the country. And let me just take a couple minutes and show you how the whole thing works. This is the Shawamri family. Salim, who's actually been with me in Atlanta. We were here in 2000 together after the first demolition of his home. We were here and we were on CNN. Elise arranged that. We had our 15 minutes of fame. But Salim has been here in Atlanta with me. Arabia, his wife, and at that time there's 6 children. They're Palestinians that had been, whose families, they were born after 48, but whose families had been driven out of Israel in 1948. Salim grew up in the old city of Jerusalem. Arabia's side of the family, their cousins, went to Jordan. And then they were married and went to Saudi Arabia, where Salim worked as a construction engineer. And when the Oslo peace process began in 1993, like thousands of Palestinians, Salim and Arabia decided to come home to be part of rebuilding their country. They came back and they bought a small plot of land in the town of Anata. Anata, if we're in a church, we should say, Anata is the hometown of the prophet Jeremiah. In the Bible, it's called Anatot. And there's actually a big military base next door to Anata that's called Anatot. I'm not certain that the prophet Jeremiah would be happy with what's happening in his hometown. They bought this plot of land because it's close to Shuafat refugee camp, where Salim grew up eventually after they moved out of the old city. And so, like all Palestinian families, they had to apply to the Israeli authorities for a building permit because it falls in the West Bank. This is even before areas A and B and C, but it falls in area C today. He applied 3 times, each time paying $5,000 to apply. So this whole process is obviously unaffordable for the average Palestinian. 3 times, and he's refused each time. And here's where we begin to see how the occupation really works. Israel, first of all, denies that it has an occupation. It says this is all our country. You can't occupy your own country. So there is no occupation. And Israel's trying to project the idea of simply normal, proper administration. So that, how would it justify demolishing 30,000 homes of one particular population, not allowing one particular population, the Palestinians, to even build houses, and then build settlements for 500,000 Israelis on the same land, and still sell itself as the only democracy in the Middle East? Well, it does it by using mechanisms that are dry, gray, boring, Kafkaesque mechanisms of zoning, planning, law, administration, and bureaucracy. And I hope I don't put you to sleep. But that's the way, and that conceals the occupation, and that's how you can control people and oppress people without seeming to do so, because it's being done not by the military, not by hitting them over the head, which you often do anyway, but rather by bureaucratic means. So the way it's done is this: just the whole West Bank, almost the whole West Bank, has been zoned as agricultural land. And that's it. It doesn't matter if half the West Bank is the Judean desert. It's agricultural land. And therefore, when somebody like Salim comes in to apply for a building permit, the answer is, geez, you know, we'd like to accommodate you, but this is agricultural land. But you can say, well, then how did you build 200 settlements on the same land? This is Ma'ale Adumim. This is a settlement of about 50,000 people. And here's Salim's land. It's the same. So how does that happen if Salim can't build? Well, it's simple. Israelis sit on the planning commissions. I mean, it's so simple that it's almost self-evident. And if you're on the planning commission, to rezone from agriculture to residential takes a second. It's all legal. And so you can have Israelis building and Palestinians can't. And it's democratic. It's normal. It's proper administration. So finally, like thousands of Palestinian families, Salim and Arabia had to build a small home for themselves without a building permit. And right away, they were given a demolition order by the civil administration. Here's where language comes in. Israel calls its military government a civil administration. Again, to lower the military profile and give the idea of normal administration. Okay, the family was living in their home for 5 years. You know, there's so many houses that are in line to be demolished that a Palestinian sort of does a cold calculation. You know, there's tens of thousands of demolition orders. In East Jerusalem alone, there are 20,000 demolition orders against Palestinian homes. So you say, you know, I'll build, maybe they won't come for a year. And you know, maybe peace will break out. Maybe they won't come for 5 years. Maybe I'll win the lottery and they'll never come. Because there really is a lottery. There are 4.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. Last year, the Israeli government granted 18 building permits. So it really is, I mean, if they wouldn't grant any, then nobody would play the game. But if you make it almost like a lottery, just like here with the lottery, you buy into it even though you know you're not going to win. So that like thousands of Palestinian families, they had to build a home, lived in the home for 5 years. And one day in July of 1998, there's a knock on the door. They're having lunch. Salim answers the door. And here are the officials of the civil administration. I don't know what civil servants look like in Georgia, but these are Rami and Micha, two not only civilian workers in the civil administration, but settlers. Because the civil administration is located in the middle of the West Bank. The only Israeli civilians that go work there are settlers that are ideologically committed to getting Arabs out of our country. And they're put in positions of authority to decide which Palestinian will be demolished tomorrow, in which Palestinians can live for another year in their homes. Accompanied, of course, by dozens of soldiers. Rami said to Salim, "Is this your house?" Salim said, "Yes, it's my house." He said, "No, it isn't. It's our house now. You got 15 minutes to get your belongings out. We're going to demolish it." Now, what would you do? You're not a criminal. You know, this is your home. I mean, you wouldn't say, "Dear, would you please help me take out the dining room table?" You would protest. You would yell. I don't know what you would do. And when that happens, the soldiers literally kick in. They're not just there for decoration. And Salim was beaten and thrown out of his house. In all the commotion, Salim was outside with the soldiers. Arabia managed to slam the door of the house shut and lock it, with her and her kids inside. So the soldiers, and then she started to frantically call, and we happened to be nearby, actually. It was kind of a weird coincidence, and managed to get to the scene, and that's how I took these pictures. Arabia locked herself in the house with her kids. So the soldiers broke the windows and threw in tear gas canisters. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a whiff of tear gas outside, but it's pretty overpowering. And this was inside the home. Then they broke down the door. Arabia was carried out unconscious. The kids running and screaming in every direction. And this is a trauma that's going to stay with these kids forever. You know, it's not that a home is demolished, too bad, and the next day you get on with your life. And these are kids who see their parents, beaten, humiliated, homes demolished, the tear gas, the violence, the fear, and everything. It stays with them forever. And I found 2 tear gas canisters after this. The tear gas was manufactured in the federal laboratories in Philadelphia. And it says, it's written on the canisters for outdoor use only. And the family was then taken out of the house. So here's where we get into the act. If we can, we get to the site of the demolition, and we chain ourselves in the house, we get on the roof, we get in front of bulldozers, which is why I'm built this way. And we try to resist the demolition. Now, we're not going to save this house. It's gone. But if we can make enough commotion, we call diplomats. And I have to say, the American consulate in Jerusalem is very good. The American consulate comes out, and the European consulates and so on, we call diplomats, we call journalists, we activate our social media networks, and if we can make enough commotion around this, they'll demolish this house, but maybe they've come to demolish 10 houses. So maybe we can sit, but they'll retreat. And maybe we've saved 3, 4, 5 houses by doing that. Finally, we're out of the house, the family's out of the house. The civil administration subcontracts to commercial building companies. If you happen to own a company, if you happen to own a bulldozer, you can apply for a contract to the civil administration. It's a commercial deal. And you win the contract. So Rami and Micha say to the contractor, throw everything out of the house. Get everything out. We want to demolish it. You have 5 minutes, 10 minutes. They want to do it fast because people are coming back and there's starting to be a resistance. So whatever you can throw out, you throw out. Here they send in some foreign workers. This is a guy from Romania. And they throw everything out. You can see everything is ripped out. Your papers are flying. I mean, imagine what you have in your home, which is really your sacred space. And everything is thrown out and ruined, and the humiliation and the invasiveness and everything. And then the bulldozer comes to demolish the home. And it comes through the wall that Salim built around his home, because you can see it's not exactly agricultural land. He brought truckloads of earth, of soil, in order to plant a garden around his house. He planted 52 fruit trees around the house. They come through the garden and begin to demolish the house. And here is a tragedy and a tragedy. The driver of the bulldozer is a Palestinian. You know, he's just a guy that works for this company. But one day he'll come to work and the boss will say, you're going to go build a road. The next day he comes and the boss says, you're going to demolish a home. And he was a friend of Salim's. So you can imagine what's going on in his mind as he demolishes the home of his friend. And here's Salim lying on the ground. And here's where house demolitions becomes a very important source of reframing the conflict. Where Israel wins, and just go talk to your members of Congress and you'll find this out in a second, or your president, or the press. Where Israel wins is by convincing everyone that it's the victim. You see, everything Israel does is simply a reaction to terrorism or to security. We're simply defending ourselves, which is what Obama said today. In the midst of raining missiles on Gaza, that Israel has the right to defend itself. And somebody said, somebody just told me this over dinner. Somebody asked the State Department spokesperson, what about the Palestinians' right of self-defense? You know, and the State Department spokesman said, apparently, what I understood was, I don't understand your question. So, this is a great reframing because this demolition, like all the others, has nothing whatsoever to do with security. In other words, if I would ask you, why is Israel demolishing Palestinian homes? The only explanation you could give me that Israel leaves you with is that, well, these are homes of terrorists. That's the only thing that Israel, the only explanation that makes sense. Well, if Salim was a terrorist or a criminal, he wouldn't be lying on the ground watching his home be demolished. He'd be in jail. He'd be arrested. So this opens the question, wait a minute. If these houses aren't being demolished for security reasons, then what's going on? There's something going on that they're not telling us. And that is that the occupation is proactive. That these homes are being demolished so Israel can take the land. You see? And you can go all the way down the occupation with the same thing. Israel did not build 200 settlements for security. It's a proactive, and it's never claimed that. It's a proactive claim to the land, to Judea and Samaria. The root of the wall, the uprooting of 2 million olive and fruit trees, the economic closure, all the policies of Israel in the West Bank cannot be explained by security. And that's why the house demolition issue is so powerful in terms of reframing.
Yes, does Salim have title to the land?
Yes, Salim owns the land.
And what can you describe the mechanism Israel uses to confiscate the land?
Yeah, it's what I said. In other words, Salim bought the land. The Palestinians, now, I don't want to get too much into detail. You can buy land and have it registered, like Salim did, with the civil administration, actually. So there's no contest that he owns the land. The problem is that it's zoned as agricultural land, and therefore he can't build on it. What happens in most of the West Bank, though, just go on for a second, that is that, Palestinian society was basically a peasant society. And peasants all over the world distrust the central government. It takes their crops, it drafts them into their armies, like the Ottoman army. And so you don't want anything, the civil government is the enemy. You don't want to cooperate. And so the Palestinians developed their own localized form of land ownership. I would buy land from you, and I would get what's called a kusham, which is a deed. And the deed was signed, my neighbor signed in the north that they recognize as the border. My neighbors in the east would sign, in the south, in the west, and so on. And then some religious figure would stamp it. And that was my deed. You see? Well, in 1948, Jordan took the West Bank. And Jordan tried to register the lands formally, the Palestinian lands, in the land registry office in Amman. And the Palestinians resisted that. Palestinians also didn't want the Jordanian government to register the lands and be the government. So there was a lot of resistance, and they got about a third of the way down the West Bank to roughly around Nablus by 1967. And when Israel conquered the West Bank in 67, the first thing it did was suspend the land registry process. And then Israel said, okay, all the land registered in Jordan, which is like the top third of the West Bank, will recognize the Palestinians' land ownership. And that's why you don't have many settlements up there. The rest of the land, 72% really, of the rest of the West Bank, that's simply Kushan, that isn't registered with Jordan, we don't recognize that ownership, and they declared that land state land. So that it doesn't matter if you have a Kushan going back 200 or 300 years, it's not recognized. And that's only one little, there's all kinds of, there's also military orders that give the military governor, the commanding officer, the right to confiscate any land at all for military reasons. I mean, there's a lot of ways the Palestinians lose their land. So that, at any rate, house demolitions is a powerful way of reframing and showing that the occupation is proactive and not simply a matter of security. And the home was demolished. So what we do is rebuild homes as political acts of resistance. That's our main way of resisting the occupation. And we do so with help of people like you, so we'll come to that in a minute. We raise money from people because, the Bill Gates Foundation is not going to give us money to rebuild Palestinian homes. From people and churches support our work a lot. The Mennonite Church of Minnesota they gave us $50,000 from their love offering to rebuild several Palestinian homes. So we've built 187 homes over the last 12 or 13 years as political acts of resistance. In other words, from a humanitarian basis, it doesn't make any sense. How is 187 out of 30,000? But if you look at it as 187 acts of joint resistance, because it's illegal to rebuild homes, of Israelis and Palestinians and internationals together, that's very meaningful. So we went out and we decided we were going to rebuild Salim and Arabia's home. We went out to build Israelis, Palestinians, and you can see these people with their red baseball caps. These are called the Christian Peacemaker teams. These are American Christians, mainly from the peace churches, the Mennonites, the Quakers, Church of the Brethren, and other denominations that come and they have a presence in Hebron, where they stand between the settlers and the soldiers and the Palestinians, and they come to work with us. They've been active for many years in the West Bank. And we began to rebuild the home. We work through Palestinian organizations. This is the Land Defense Committee that we work with. And here you get a good sense of the agricultural land we're talking about. And it really is a genuine peace-building action. In other words, it takes us a couple of weeks to build a home. So we're sitting together, we're eating together, we're working together. Here's Salim with Israelis and Palestinians and internationals eating maklube, which is the Palestinian national dish. Here's Arabia, between two Israeli women rebuilding her home. Here's a woman who's scared, intimidated, traumatized, who at least who's smiling, who at least is doing something literally concrete to begin to rebuild her life. And the house began to go up. You see, we put the concrete blocks on, and we poured the concrete for the roof. And I had an idea when we did that, and the building was, you see, there's scaffolding, hard to see, but I had a feeling the civil administration was going to come back. So we spent the night. Here's a fellow Jim Satterwhite again from the Christian Peacemaker teams. We spent the night, and sure enough, at 4:30 in the morning, the Army returned, the civil administration, to demolish the home. The soldiers, the bulldozer, Micha, they returned, and it was easy to push over the house. It was only wet concrete by that time. And one just little curiosity, this in the background is the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus, right here. And this building right here is the Truman Center for Peace. So you can sit in the library of the Truman Center for Peace and watch homes being demolished. And the home was gone for the second time. Salim's face kind of says it all. This was the coffee. We didn't even get a chance to drink our morning coffee yet. These were the blankets we slept under, and the house was gone. So we decided we had to rebuild again. This is the political logic of rebuilding even when homes are demolished. We are not going to let the occupation win. And if they demolish 100 times, we'll rebuild it 101 times. So we came out again, all of us, to rebuild the home. Now this is taking time because we also want to be sure that the family is with us, because each time it's a trauma for them. They can be fined, they can be arrested. I mean, it takes tremendous courage for a Palestinian family to do this. So we go slowly, and also it takes us time to raise the money sometimes. And we managed to get up. You can see a small home here. And the family moved in to this house that we built. The next day, the civil administration came back again. And the whole story repeats itself. Here's Micha, foreign workers. This time they were workers from West Africa that were hired by the contractor. And the house is demolished again by a Caterpillar bulldozer. And we have to emphasize that the Presbyterian Church, a couple weeks ago in Detroit, voted to divest the Caterpillar, which was tremendously a courageous act to do. And the house was demolished again. Salim says the demolition of a home is really the demolition of a family. Because human beings can't live without homes. We know from our homeless that a human being really can't function without a home as a living space. But men, women, and children react very differently. For men, like Salim, it's a tremendously emasculating experience. A man can't protect his family. A man can't provide shelter for his family. It's very humiliating. You're humiliated in front of your kids, which is probably the worst part of it. But men work outside the home. They can go out. They can vent. They can go out and they can yell and they can cry. There are men around other people. For women, it's a double tragedy. Because most Palestinian women don't work outside of the home. For them, their home is their whole domestic sphere. It's what defines them as people, as women, as mothers, as wives. So when a woman loses her home, she sometimes falls into a kind of a mourning. She withdraws in there. She doesn't know what to do now. How do I feed my family? She's disoriented to some degree. Now you can't live in a tent forever. So what happens at some point is that you have to move into the home of either your husband's parents or your husband's brother. So now you're taking, and this isn't for a weekend. They have 6 kids. They're moving into the home of, now she's moving into her husband's family's home. And they have 6, 7, 8 kids. I mean, they also are living in inadequate conditions. They can't build housing. And you're moving in, and it creates tremendous domestic tensions. I mean, this is really the demolition of a family that Salim is talking about. Arabia is after him, you have to get me out, I need my own space, I need to go home. Salim can't do it, he has no money, he can't rebuild, he's trapped. Solidarity aside, there begins to be a lot of conflict between the women. Here's a woman living in another woman's home, doesn't have her own space. And it leads to, I'll be honest, it leads to domestic violence in times. And you don't have divorce in Arab society, especially in working class Arab society. So the tensions within the house are really tremendous over the demolition issue. And then, of course, there's the kids. For kids, your home is your security, your room, your space. Well, kids lose all of that as well. This is Lena, one of Salim's daughters, who during one of the demolitions went blind. She went blind. And we rushed her to the doctor. Salim and I took her to the doctor. And while we were in the hospital with the doctor, her sight began to return. And the doctor said this was a kind of a hysterical blindness. It's what happens when your mind shuts down because of the trauma. You just can't process it anymore, and your mind shuts down. And he said to us, if her vision hadn't returned on its own, there was no way that her sight would have been restored because it wasn't a physiological condition. So you can imagine the depth of trauma that these kids are living. Nevertheless, the family wanted to rebuild again. So we rebuilt the house yet another time. Israelis, internationals, Palestinians building together. Here's Arabia with some of our activists rebuilding their home. And the home was rebuilt, this time with a mural. There was an American labor muralist, Mike Allowitz, who was paid, the project was paid for by American trade unions, who put a mural on the side of the house. It was a dead Caterpillar bulldozer amidst a pile of dead armaments. It's hard to see, but here are Israeli, Palestinian, and international workers marching together. And hovering over the scene were the forms of two women who died in demolitions. One of them was Rachel Corey. I know her cousin Beth, I think, lives here in Atlanta. Rachel, was an American college student who was killed in Gaza when the bulldozer ran over her twice, defending a Palestinian home. And the other figure is a Palestinian woman named Nuha Swedan, a woman who lived in Gaza as well, the pregnant mother of 10 children, who was killed in her bed at night when a bulldozer demolished their home while she was sleeping, while the family was sleeping. And those figures kind of hover over the scene. And the house stood, and we used it for peace purposes. We had conferences there. We had, Salim and Arabia would host groups. And in January of 2012, the Israeli army came back again, and the home was demolished for the 5th time. So we just, and again, the scene repeats itself, Arabia and the furniture. So we decided to rebuild the home again. And I want to take, it's 4 minutes if I can do this, and just show you what a rebuilding is like. Let me see if this works. I'm not sure. If not, then I'll maybe try to 1 sec here. Because it's we condensed the whole rebuilding over 2 weeks. It was finish up in a minute. At any rate, we rebuilt the home. And then in November of 2012, the Army came back again, and the home was demolished for the 6th time. So we decided not to abandon the family. We didn't want to not rebuild. We didn't want the message to be, okay, you demolish 6 times, we give up. And abandon the family after everything they've been through. But we also thought it really wasn't worthwhile to put more money into a house that's going to be demolished. So what we did, you can see, is we excavated the ruins of the house. You see, almost like an archaeological thing. We excavated the ruins and began to expose, concrete surfaces of the house, metal, the rooms down below, even furniture. And then we put, in a waterproofing way, the same pictures I showed you tonight. The whole history of the house, we put them on these concrete surfaces. So that today you can walk through the demolition of the home, and we bring diplomats and journalists and activists and tour groups. You can walk through and get the whole history of the house on the site. So finally, let me just take another minute to finish up and go back to the political thing for another minute. The two-state solution, I would say, is gone. And I don't know, I can't imagine anybody today arguing with that. I know J Street and some of a lot of the Jewish community would still argue that for the two-state solution simply because they can't go anywhere else. The implications of the two-state solution being gone are tremendous because there's three ways out, in a way, of this conflict. There's three directions that this could take. One is apartheid. It's apartheid, just like in South Africa, and that's this idea. The idea that you lock the Palestinians into areas A and B. You see, you take out the settlement blocks, you put in the root of the wall, you take out Jerusalem, and this is what you get. A Palestinian Bantustan on 15% of Palestine. Rather than the 22%, but certainly not viable. No border with an Arab country, no water, no territorial contiguity, no Jerusalem. So that this is apartheid. And we use the apartheid language. I mean, Jimmy Carter started, or gave it credibility and got a firestorm. But it is. Apartheid is basically defined by two elements. One is separation. When one population separates itself from the others, that's the apartheid. Apartheid means separateness. And then when that population creates a regime of permanent institutionalized domination. So separation and domination are apartheid. And it doesn't matter if it's based on race, like in South Africa, or it's based on nationality or religion, or the color of your eyes. Once you have a regime, it isn't just discrimination. It's a regime. This is the way it works. Based on separation and domination, that's apartheid. Actually, what the UN calls the crime of apartheid. And it's very much like South Africa in that, the South African Bantustans were on 11% of South Africa, leaving 89% to be a white democracy. Whereas here you've got a Bantustan on 15%, leaving 85% of the country to be a Jewish democracy. So there's a lot of parallels here. Ironically, everybody says, oh, apartheid. Jimmy Carter really got slammed for that. Apartheid is the liberal approach in Israel. This is the approach of the Labour Party. Rabin, Ehud Barak, Shimon Peres, our Nobel Peace Prize winning president, they're the ones that constructed the apartheid regime. The settlements were started by the Labour Party. The settlement blocks that Bush agreed with, that was Labour Party. Barak that defined the settlement blocks. The wall was Labour. Sharon was against building the wall. said I spent my whole life trying to erase the Green Line, making this one country where you want me to build a wall in the middle of it. So that apartheid is the Labour Party. Netanyahu and the right say, well, wait a minute. Why should we give 15% of our country to Arabs? It's all ours. And so I would submit to you that there's a situation worse than apartheid. And that's what we call warehousing. It's a word, Angela Davis uses that term. It's a term that comes out actually of the American prison system, where prisoners are warehoused. They're inmates, they're wards of the state. They're locked away, nobody sees them. One second. Nobody sees them, they're gone. There's no negotiations with them, they're not assigned. And if they riot, because we use non-political language, the guards have every right and duty to put them down. That is exactly how Israel views the Palestinians. They're not a people. They have no national rights. They're not a side. We're not going to negotiate genuinely with them. And they're not going to get our state, or a state of their own inside our country. Period. And this, I would say, beginning with the kidnappings of the 3 kids a couple of weeks ago, where Israel opened a military operation, Operation Brother's Keeper, that really had nothing to do with the kidnapping of these kids. In the West Bank, where about 2,500 homes were ransacked in the West Bank. I mean, a whole reign of terror that continues. Was the other military operation now, Operation Protective Edge in Gaza. These are 2 military operations of warehousing. The message to the Palestinians is, it's over. There's no more carry. There's no more negotiations. There's no more a 2-state solution. You are not assigned, and this is our country. And you have 3 options. You can shut up and know your place and live in areas A and B and Gaza and little islands inside Israel, and we'll let you stay there, but if you shut up. Or you can leave, or you die. That's the message today of the attacks on Gaza and the attacks in the West Bank. It's absolute, simply all-out violence with no political agenda other than to say to the Palestinians, it's the same message that guards have in a prison when you're putting down a riot. They're not saying we want to talk to you, we have rights. They're simply saying we're suppressing an illegitimate riot. And that's the way it is. So those are 2 options. Israel believes that it can get away with warehousing because it has the support of the American Congress. Everything boils down to that. But there's a third out. I would hope that for all of us here, those options are unacceptable. We're not going to accept apartheid. We're not going to accept the warehousing of Palestinians. So the only other option, it seems to me mathematically, that Israel has left us is a 1-state solution. One democratic state of equal rights for everybody living in this country. Which means, and I'll be clear about it, and that's why the Jewish community can't go there. It means that Israel can no longer be a Jewish state. It's become a binational state, a state of all the people living here, and that's Israel's doing. Again, Israel is the one that made this 1 state. So we have to, that's what we have to insist on. And I think, just to finish, I think we're in the midst of a collapse. And I think what's happening now is that the Palestinian Authority is going to leave the scene. I don't think Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority can survive all of this. All the attacks, the humiliation, they become simply a collaborationist regime. And I think sooner rather than later it's going to collapse. If the PA collapses, and the PA is what keeps the lid on it, the Palestinian Authority has a little army, a militia of 30,000 armed people trained by the Americans, trained by General Dayton. You see? Well, the PA is gone. What happens to those 30,000 armed people? Hamas is in the wings, which is why Israel's attacking Hamas. And it would simply create a vacuum that Israel couldn't tolerate. Which means that Israel would then, in my view, invade and reoccupy all the Palestinian cities. I think the occupation will come back. In fact, I'm not so sure after Israel invades Gaza that it's ever going to leave. I don't think it's, and Lieberman, our foreign minister, is pushing very hard to have Israel permanently reoccupy Gaza. And then in this vacuum after the Palestinian Authority, Israel will reoccupy the rest of the West Bank. Doing that at the same time that it annexes the settlement blocks. Because the United States agreed to that anyway. So it would, by the way, annex the settlement blocks. And that creates warehousing. And I think that that's unsustainable. I mean, Israel thinks it can get away with it. I think it's unsustainable, and there would be tremendous resistance all over the world to something like that. And the United States, I think, would become even more isolated. And it seems to me that as the world tries to cast around for how to get out, the idea of one democratic state becomes relevant. Today, it's not on the table. Today, nobody's talking about it. You can't advocate for it. But given the collapse that is happening, that could be over in a few weeks. I mean, things are moving very rapidly. Or a few months. I think new possibilities will open up for a just solution that don't exist today. And we have to be, and I'll end on this, we have to be the watchdogs. Because governments are not our friends. They are not our friends. Governments will not do the right thing unless they're pushed by the people. Governments don't resolve conflicts, and they certainly don't resolve conflicts in a just way. Justice, Christian values, human rights, I mean, that's ridiculous stuff for realpolitik, foreign policy wonks. They made Carter a laughingstock because he's trying to introduce human rights as the guiding principle of American foreign policy. So that if we want to resolve this conflict in a just way and preserve the idea of human rights and human dignity and our values and protect and advance the interests of both Palestinians and Israelis, we have to be active. We have to be the watchdogs. We have to begin to formulate solutions. We have to support the Israelis and Palestinians, the people on the ground. And we have to keep the process honest. Because the governments will not do it. The governments will try to find the path of least resistance. And I'm telling you, governments can live very well with apartheid. They have no problem with that. And so I think that this is a conflict that's a global conflict that really affects our lives and that we have to be active in trying to resolve. So. Now we have time for questions. Let me just do one little bit of housekeeping before. We really need any financial assistance we can get. I mean, I literally go around the world hat in hand. Because, the work we do is, I think, holy work. It's very important political work. But we don't get support from foundations, from governments. We really need your help. So I'll pass the hat. I think Elise will pass the basket on the other side. I'm not looking. So you can give or not give. You can either put money in the hat, or you can write a check to ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, ICAHD, USA. And it's tax deductible. We have, ICAD USA is a 501c3. So you can, if you want to write a check, take it out to ICAD USA. And I thank you for that.
you online at all? Credit cards?
No, we are online. Someone told me yesterday that our PayPal button isn't working. So, but the information is online if you want to send a check. Okay, there was actually a question a long time ago. Here,
Yeah, thanks for your great presentation. You've been really so well informed. Thank you. My question is about apartheid, this system of apartheid. Why are we not calling it genocide? Why are we not calling it ethnic cleansing?
Well, it is called ethnic cleansing. Ilan Pappé, P-A-P-P-E, is a very well-known Israeli historian. As a book is called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He's a very respected Israeli historian. He talks about the 1947-48 period and talks about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The whole issue of genocide is interesting. You know, there was a certain compromise in the 1950s when genocide became in international law, you know, against genocide. It was originally intended, there was a fellow named Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish figure, Holocaust survivor, who was the one that pushed, he coined the term genocide and pushed it through the UN system. And he meant genocide to be not only the physical destruction of a people, but also the cultural destruction of a people. The inability of a people to reproduce itself. That it couldn't, it lost its land, it lost its identity, it lost its ability to continue as a cultural group. And that part of genocide was removed during the process of formulating the law. So today, genocide legally, when you want to enforce it, really means more the physical destruction of a people. And so there are some people that, you know, legal experts that say what's happening in the occupied territories falls short of genocide in that sense. It conforms to genocide in the broader sense that Lemkin meant it, because the Palestinians really are being destroyed as a people, but the physical elimination of people isn't at a level where it justifies genocide. So there's a lot of, you know, people are afraid of overstating the case in order to give our enemies an opening to say, you see, they're just anti-Semitic, they're anti-Israel, so we try to be very careful in terms of our framing.
I wonder, it seems like there are two very prominent colleges that still are having states doing
Well, they're both friends of mine.
What was the question?
And Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky still advocate a two-state solution. And, you know, what about that? I don't know, I simply don't agree with them. I think Norman Finkelstein has a very strange position. And I don't know why. I'm not going to get into psychology. Those of you who know Norman know that that's a piece of it. But Norman, he has a position that says, and I don't agree with it, that says the right of self-determination is an international law, which isn't exactly true. And that therefore Israelis have a right of self-determination in the state of Israel as much as Palestinians have a right of self-determination in the state of Palestine. But self-determination is a right, but it doesn't have to be expressed in a state. There's a lot of peoples that have, I mean, if you think of the UK, the Scotch and the Welsh and the Irish in Northern Ireland have a meaningful degree of self-determination, including their own parliaments, without having an actual state. They're a part of the United Kingdom. So Norman's, the idea that self-determination means that Israel has to exist as a state, I don't think, there's nothing in international that would prevent the emergence of one democratic state. It could be democratic and it could be binational. So that doesn't really work for me. I think Noam Chomsky's problem is that he doesn't think that it's workable. That we're not going to get to the right of return. We're not. It's not doable. I don't know. I think he's right today, but I think if given the collapse I'm talking about, if I'm right, I think that will open possibilities that don't exist today. So that would be my take.
That doesn't seem to you that Zionism really just want to hang on to the idea of a Jewish state?
Well, that's sort of the subtext. You know, I think a lot of people, can see that the two-state solution is going and gone. But again, like I said, the implications are tremendous. It means the end of Israel as a Jewish state. It means, the emergence of some binational entity. I mean, it's a tremendously emotional issue for Jews who want a Jewish state for whatever reason, even if they're not going there. So that we have a problem. That's the problem I find with J Street. And that is that they're asserting a position of a two-state solution that can't be any more justified or supported by what's actually happening on the ground. In other words, their political position is disconnected from the political reality. And that becomes very dangerous when you start to have your whole political position based on what you would like to have happen, or your ideology, or what's acceptable to you, and you can't go with the actual flow of events on the ground. I think you're misreading, and that's dangerous. That's what I would argue. But I have no input. I could never speak to a J Street group. I'm never invited, God forbid, to the Federation or to a synagogue. So, so these views are kept out of the discussion. But I think it's detrimental. All right, I want to call my woman, but with his hands up.
Yes, I have a question. It's interesting that you were paying the bill to home. I heard that the Christian right, 70 million strong in America, is financing a lot of construction of the settlements. Is that right?
That's right.
How do they fit into your scenario?
Well, how do I fit into their scenario?
I'll ask them when I see them.
I look there. I mean, the Christian Zionists, as they call themselves, is a very powerful bloc in the United States and in certain parts of Europe. They have a lot of clout in Holland and certain other places, and they've invested tens of millions of dollars. I mean, they put much more money actually into Israel than the Jewish community does. John Hagee and Pat Robertson is in the process of building a $65 million Jesus Park in Tiberias. There's a part of Tiberias where the Jordan River flows that people are baptized for centuries. And he's getting that land from the Israeli government to build a Jesus theme park. So that's his whole thing. But the other part of it is that it serves Israel because the idea is that if we can channel Christian pilgrims north to Tiberias, to the Jesus theme land, then they don't have to go to Bethlehem, which is Palestinian, that's what we should be doing, you see. So it's an attempt to divert Christian pilgrims from going into Palestinian areas. So the Christian right, and of course in the United States, it's very powerful, in the Republican Party in particular. So that, and Netanyahu plays on that. Jerry Falwell, when he was alive, had a jet given to him by the Israeli government. And they said, any time you want to bring a governor, members of Congress, pastors, anybody, you can get on the plane and come. Netanyahu preaches regularly in Hagee's church in Texas. So that's a tremendous advantage to Israel.
Jim Crow all the way down the line. So that's nothing new. I mean, it's just been manufactured over there. Secondly, I don't know what kind of rights the people in Palestine have for migration. What happened? First, would they be able to live in an Israeli home? Is that allowed? And if they did live on Israeli territory or in Israeli territory, what rights of voting and so forth would they have to represent themselves in the country?
Look, let's just take another couple minutes. I know it's getting late. I'm not going to go. It's maybe this and maybe one other question or something. I'll let you go. You know, it's not Jim Crow. It's like Jim Crow. On the surface it is, but the difference is that in the United States, with all the racism and the discrimination, and it was institutionalized to a large degree, nevertheless, the United States was a democracy. And the concept of the United States was that the country belongs to all its citizens. So you had that ability to go to the Supreme Court, to have Congress enact the voting rights law. You had, in a way, as bad as it was, you had the wind at your back to some degree because you weren't fighting the concept of the country. You were fighting the discrimination. Israel is not a democracy. Israel is what we call, the fancy word, is an ethnocracy. An ethnocracy is when a country belongs to one particular people. It doesn't pretend to be a democracy. Russia, and Zionism came out of Eastern Europe. It came out of Russia and Poland. So Russia, Poland, Germany before World War II, these were all countries that belonged not to all the peoples living in them, but to the groups. Russia belonged to the Russians. And when the Soviet Empire expanded, they were Russified. In other words, you sent Russians to live in Latvia. I mean, until today, you know, the problems in the Ukraine, because Russians were sent to live in the Ukraine. The Ukrainians did not become Russians. You see, it's a tribal kind of nationalism. And that's what Israel became, because that's where Zionism comes from. So the idea is that the land of Israel, this country, belongs to the Jewish people. It does not belong to all the inhabitants of the country. And therefore, when we privilege Jews, it's not discrimination. It's not racism. It's not Jim Crow, because yes, that's what the whole purpose of Zionism is to Judaize the land of Israel. So when you say Jerusalem should be a Jewish city and we're going to push out Arabs, in Israel that's a good thing, because we're reclaiming, rebuilding our ancient capital, you see? So it's different from Jim Crow in that it is the system, and you can't fight it unless you reinvent the country, you know, and turn this ethnocracy into a democracy. So it means then that there's Palestinian citizens of Israel, 1.5 million. They're about 20% of the Israeli population who are citizens. They vote, but they're second-class citizens by definition. If you just look at the flag of Israel, it only represents the Jews. It's the Star of David. It doesn't represent about 30% of Israeli citizens who aren't Jews. You see, so there's a lot of institutional discrimination. For example, 93% of the land of Israel is reserved by law only to Jews. And non-Jews, even if you're a citizen of Israel, can't live on that land. And many other things. Now, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem are not Israeli citizens. They're really stateless people. They're not Jordanians, they're not Israelis, and when they travel, well, from Gaza, they almost don't travel. You go through Egypt and you get some kind of a travel document. From the West Bank, you get an Israeli-issued, let's say, a travel document. But Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are not allowed to go through the airport in Israel. They have to go to Jordan or Egypt and fly out. So they couldn't, and they need permits to come into Israel. So they could not live in Israel or the Jewish, certainly in the Jewish area of the country.
They can't stay overnight either.
And they can't stay over, even if they have a permit, they have a permit for the work hours that they can be in the country. And the permit is actually, well, I don't get it. The permit it's not their permit. They get a permit from their employer, which then leads to all kinds of abuses in terms of employment, because I'm dependent, my employer cannot pay me or pay me below the minimum wage or make me work 18 hours a day because I'm dependent on my employer for getting this permit. It's not my permit, it's his permit. It's almost like an indentured servant. So it goes on and on, but the system in Israel really is institutionalized discrimination, and that's where I think it's not only a matter of a one-state solution, it really is a reconception of the whole country. And that's what, it's going to be hard for Israelis and Jews here to do that. When South Africa ended apartheid, it wasn't some technical thing that, okay, now black Africans can vote. It was the whole country was reinvented. You had a new constitution. The whole country went from being a white ethnocracy to being a multiracial democracy for everybody. Now, again, we know the reality is far from the concept, but nevertheless, South Africa reconceptualized itself. That's what Israel's going to have to do in order to move into a new one-state reality. Last, not least.
Do you think the fighting and turmoil in Syria and in Iraq will have any impact either way on the issue of Palestine, Israel, or is it simply a separate issue?
In a way, from the Israeli point of view, they're separate. Israel doesn't, it's very funny. It's almost like Israel is in Tennessee. It doesn't care. It's like happening in some other continents, Syria, Iraq, Iran. It doesn't affect even Gaza. The rockets are falling in these little places, but it really isn't affecting the daily life of Israelis too much. Because, Israel feels that it has military superiority, can't really be hit. Here and there, but, for example, the Israeli government said if there's a war with Iran, that Israel's itching to do, Iran will throw a lot of missiles, and maybe 800 Israelis will be killed, which is fine. That falls within the acceptable range of casualties. So really, Israel is pretty disconnected. Where I think it matters is with the United States. And this is the open question. It's hard to explain why Kerry put all this energy and effort into trying to resolve this conflict. It was clear it wasn't going to happen from the beginning. I can't believe that he didn't know that. So I think what it was that the United States wants to get out of the Middle East. It's beginning to draw down from Afghanistan, and it wanted to get out. This is before ISIS and before Iraq was falling apart. I think the idea was we will really try to resolve this conflict in Israel-Palestine. In one of his trips, Kerry came with 130 advisors. And they really, I give them credit. I think they really tried. But I think the idea was that if we don't succeed, that's our exit strategy. Now we can do what we really want to do, and that's the Asian pivot. The United States really wants to shift to China. And China is the real issue for the United States, and it wants to get out as much as possible from the Middle East. And I think this was the strategy. And then Iraq happened, and ISIS, and all that pulled it back in. So you might say that the Americans' inability to extricate itself from the Middle East, with all these conflicts that are simply going on and on, And you know, China doesn't have oil, so China is going to be pulled into this. If something happens to Iran, you know, China is left without oil to a certain degree. But that's which moves China. All kinds of things are happening. China's moving closer to Russia, and you're beginning to have a new bloc of powers against the United States and Europe. And Israel, you know, this is the interesting thing. You know, Obama talks about how Israel's our only ally, and we share all these moral values with Israel. Israel is the #2 arms supplier to China. You know, Israel is not, it doesn't have all its eggs in the American basket. And as the United States is trying to deal with Iran in a peaceful way, it's pushing Israel and Saudi Arabia closer together. And Saudi Arabia has said to Israel that Israeli planes can fly over its territory to attack Iran, because Iran is a common enemy. So you're having all kinds of regional shiftings, and it could be that at some point either the United States will find itself completely isolated, or it will see that its interests have shifted fundamentally, and the wider conflict in the Middle East will begin to push it into another set of interests. I keep in mind, you know, the saying of Kissinger, our friend Henry, that countries don't have friends. Countries have interests. And I'm trying to look at American foreign policy. The weird part of it is that what, you know, Israel has become a domestic issue in the United States, not a foreign policy issue. And so you've got members of Congress, including your members of Congress, that are committed to Israel that I don't think see the wider foreign policy. They're not motivated by what's good for the United States. They're motivated by getting reelected. And Israel plays a key role in that. So you're going to have an American Congress that, in a sense, is supporting policies that are antithetical to American national interests. That's what I see. And the question is, can that be sustained? And how would that change? I don't see any hint of a change today in either party. But that's really, and that's the questions, that's where you should be going to your members of Congress and saying, how is the policy that you're supporting possibly in the interest of the United States? Thank you very much. I want to thank the church for having us, and JVP and the Leeds and all of you for your financial support.
Thank you all for coming.